Welcome to Teaching Truth. In our reflections this week, we've been thinking about the reflection of God's glory. God's glory reflected through Moses, his faithful servant and leader of the Israelite people. And in our reflections today, we want to think about the unseen glory which there was relative to Moses. Why do I say unseen glory? Well, Exodus 34 records for us that when Moses had finished speaking with the people, he put a veil on his face, as it were, to be unseen. Now, I want you just to stay with me for a few minutes today, because I want to take you to 2 Corinthians, because this actually links into Exodus 34 and this particular section of Exodus 34 where Moses' face beams with the radiance of God himself. In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul, the Apostle Paul that is, wrote to defend his ministry against those who had sought to undermine it in an attempt to mislead the church. Wolves in sheep's clothing, false shepherds, if you like, had come to Corinth and had corrupted the message of the gospel. These wolves in sheep's clothing sought to undermine Paul's influence. In a sense, they were seeking to veil the glorious authority with which Paul spoke. They criticized everything about him. They claimed that he was a false apostle, that he was a fraud whose ministry did not have the approval of God and thus lacked the glory of God. Now, stay with me, folks, because Paul countered these charges. In chapter 3, he noted that their very existence as a church was proof in and of itself that God had owned his ministry. He then makes it clear that God had used him. Though unlike the other false teachers, Paul did not take the glory or the credit for it. And then in verses 7 to 18, and this is where I'm going with this, folks, Paul fleshed this out and argued that even though the old covenant was glorious, in comparison with the gospel, the good news of the new covenant, it was merely a shadow of glory. And it's therefore in this context that Paul refers to the events of Exodus 34. Now, if you're still with me after that, great. And let's read together from 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 7, because this relates back to Exodus 34 and Moses' face beaming with the glory of God. Paul writes, "Now if the ministry that brought death, which was engraved in letters on stone, came with glory, so that the Israelites could not look steadily at the face of Moses because of its glory, fading though it was, will not the ministry of the Spirit be even more glorious? If the ministry that condemns men is glorious, how much more glorious is the ministry that brings righteousness? For what was glorious has no glory now in comparison with the surpassing glory. And if what was fading away came with glory, how much greater is the glory of that which lasts? Therefore, since we have such a hope, we are very bold. We are not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face to keep the Israelites from gazing at it while the radiance was fading away. But their minds were made dull, for to this day the same veil remains when the old covenant is read. It has not been removed because only in Christ is it taken away. Even to this day, when Moses is read, a veil covers their hearts. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Paul offers the primary reason as he writes as to why Moses veiled his face. And that reason was that the children of Israel could not look steadily at the end of what was passing away. See, Moses veiled his face because the glory that he was experiencing was not sustainable. It was external, it was temporary. In the words of 2 Corinthians 3:7, it was passing away. Some writers have suggested that Moses wore a veil for the purpose of guarding his own heart from pride, and that's plausible and that may be true in and of itself, although wearing a veil in and of itself would by default draw attention to him. But according to 2 Corinthians 3, Moses in Exodus 34 wore the veil because he knew that the glory was temporary and he did not want the people to lose heart, to become discouraged. Because with an unveiled face, it would over time be obvious that the glory was departing. And this could potentially discourage a people who were prone to walk by sight and not, or rather than by faith. And so Moses covered his face as an aid and to encourage their faith. Moses didn't want them to be discouraged by the temporary glory, and he didn't want them to settle for less by failing to see that this was temporary glory. Moses deliberately wore the veil for the purpose of pointing the people to the glory that they needed, pointing people ultimately to Jesus, the glory that only Christ would in time and could provide. See, Moses was seeking to stir within the people a hunger for the glory that would not fade away, a glory that would only fully come, as it were, when Christ came. Moses didn't want the people to place their trust in the law of God for salvation, but rather he desired for them to place their faith in the coming Messiah, the one whose glory would never fade. May we be those people, like Moses and like the Israelites, who place our faith in the one whose glory never fades, Jesus Christ himself.